Hello, this is video lecture number 46. Today we are looking at two societies at war. For our sections, we have the secession crisis first, then the Upper South chooses sides, and lastly, setting war objectives and devising strategies. So the election of Abraham Lincoln in 1860 represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power within the Union. For the first time in the history of the country, a president had been elected without any support from the slaveholding states. Furthermore, Lincoln was the candidate of a party whose central ideology was opposition to the slave power. To be sure, Lincoln's election did not mean Republican control of the federal government. Democrats, including Southern Democrats, still controlled the Congress. And the Supreme Court was still the same court that had less than 4 years earlier handed down the Dred Scott decision. But secessionists convincingly argued that the election, along with resistance to the enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and widespread Northern sympathy for John Brown, demonstrated that Northerners could no longer be depended on to protect the South's peculiar institution. South Carolina, long a hotbed of secessionist movement, led the way in leaving the Union, followed quickly by the rest of the Lower South: Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana, and Texas. In February of 1861, the 7 seceded states joined together as the new Confederate States of America. Lincoln took office on March 4th of 1861, determined to face down the secessionists, but seeking to proceed in a manner that would not spark further defections among the states of the Upper South. Now, the presence of a federal garrison at Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina, however, became a flashpoint for Confederates who regarded it as an occupying force. Insistent on continuing the Union's sovereignty over the fort, Lincoln vowed to resupply the garrison, whereupon Confederate forces began an artillery bombardment that forced the garrison's surrender. In Lincoln's eyes, secession was now rebellion, and he called for troops to suppress it, an action that sent Arkansas, Tennessee, North Carolina, and Virginia into the Confederate camp. The Civil War had begun. At first, the war was makeshift. Although the first skirmish, the Battle of Bull Run, Manassas, was a disaster for the Union side, the Confederates were scarcely able to follow up on their victory. By 1862, both sides had successfully mobilized armies and were also mobilizing their civilian populations to support the troops. Furthermore, the Confederates had found a brilliant military leader in Robert E. Lee. Thanks largely to a remarkable string of victories by Lee's Army of Northern Virginia, the Confederacy successfully held off Union forces and even launched 2 counterstrikes into Union territory in the fall of 1862. To be sure, the Union was showing greater success, though, than the Confederacy at mustering its resources, its vast resources. The Union government paid for the war with a balanced program of taxes, bond sales to a mass market, and a moderate issue of paper currency called greenbacks. The Confederacy, wedded to small and decentralized government and fearing to alienate the powerful planters, resorted to massive issues of paper money, sparking ruinous inflation. Nonetheless, many outside observers were convinced that the Confederacy would be successful in maintaining its independence and that the Union would lack the staying power to continue the struggle. And this opinion was bolstered by major Republican reverses in the 1862 elections. So let's look at it a little closer: secession and military stalemate, 1861 and 62, starting with the secession crisis. So the Civil War was called the War Between the States by Southerners, and you'll also hear the War Against Northern Aggression, and the War of Rebellion by Northerners. On December 20th of 1860, the South Carolina Convention voted unanimously to secede from the Union. Fire eaters elsewhere in the Deep South quickly followed. The secessionists met in Montgomery, Alabama in February of 1861 and proclaimed a new nation called the Confederate States of America. They adopted a new constitution, and they named a man named Jefferson Davis as its provisional president. Now, secessionist fervor was less intense in the slave states of the Upper South, and their leaders proposed federal guarantees for slavery in states where it existed. In December of 1860, President James Buchanan declared secession illegal, but denied that the federal government had the authority to restore the Union by force. South Carolina, as I mentioned earlier, demanded the surrender of Fort Sumter, which was a federal garrison located in Charleston Harbor in South Carolina. In response, President Buchanan ordered the resupply of the fort by an unarmed merchant ship. When South Carolinians fired on the ship, Buchanan refused to order the Navy to escort it into the harbor. Congress responded with a compromise called the Crittenden Plan, which called for a constitutional amendment that would permanently protect slavery from federal interference in any state where it already existed, and for the westward extension of the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the California border. Slavery would be barred north of the line and protected to the south, including any territories hereafter acquired. Now, Lincoln takes office. Lincoln upheld the first part of the Crittenden Plan to protect slavery where it already existed, but he was not willing to extend the Missouri Compromise line all the way to the California border. Lincoln declared that secession was illegal and that acts against the Union constituted insurrection. He would enforce federal laws as well as continue to possess federal property located in the seceded states. So, our next section is the Upper South chooses sides. Jefferson Davis forced the surrender of Fort Sumter on April 14th of 1861. Lincoln called in state militiamen to put down the insurrection. Although some Northerners were wary of Lincoln's Republican administration, they remained supportive of the Union cause and responded positively to Lincoln's call for the mobilization of the militias. The states of the middle and border South were forced to choose sides then in the dispute. Support from these states was crucial to the Confederacy because of these states' high populations and their access to industry and fuel. Virginia, Arkansas, Tennessee, and North Carolina joined the Confederacy after the fall of Fort Sumter. After Lincoln intervened, Missouri, Delaware, Maryland, and Kentucky stayed with the Union. All right, our next section is setting war objectives and devising strategies. Jefferson Davis's focus was on the defense of the Confederacy rather than conquering Western territories. The Confederacy only needed a military stalemate to guarantee independence. Lincoln portrayed secession as an attack on popular government, and he insisted on an aggressive military strategy and a policy of unconditional surrender. In July of 1861, General Irwin McDowell's troops were routed by PGT Beauregard's Confederate troops near Manassas Creek, a battle also called Bull Run. Lincoln replaced McDowell with George B. McClellan and enlisted an additional 1,000,000 men who would serve for 3 years in the newly created Army of the Potomac. In 1862, McClellan launched a thrust toward Richmond, Virginia, which was the capital of the Confederacy. But he moved too slowly and allowed the Confederates to mount a counterattack. Washington was then threatened when a Confederate army under the command of Stonewall Jackson marched north up the Shenandoah Valley in western Virginia. Jackson won a series of small engagements, tying down the larger Union forces. General Robert E. Lee of the South then launched an attack outside Richmond and suffered heavy casualties. But McClellan failed to exploit the advantage and Richmond remained secure in the hands of the Confederacy. Jackson and Lee routed a Union army in the Second Battle of Bull Run, then in August of 1862. The battle at Antietam Creek on September 17th of 1862 was the bloodiest single day in U.S. military history. Jackson's troops arrived just in time to save Lee's troops from defeat. Lincoln then replaced General McClellan with Ambrose E. Burnside, who later resigned and was replaced by Joseph, or Fighting Joe, Hooker. The Union dominated the Ohio River Valley, and in 1862, General Ulysses S. Grant took Fort Henry on the Tennessee River and Fort Donelson on the Cumberland River. In April, a Confederate army caught Grant by surprise near Shiloh. Grant forced a Confederate withdrawal, but suffered a great number of casualties. Now, Union naval forces, commanded by David G. Farragut, captured New Orleans, the South's financial center and largest city, giving it a base for future naval operations. Union victories in the West had significantly undermined Confederate strength in the Mississippi Valley. So, this begins the Civil War, and these are the opening phases of the Civil War. This does conclude our video lecture at this time. So, please answer the review questions at the bottom of the screen and continue on with your work.